All right, everyone. So we'll go ahead and get started on this is the last portion of the human body, more anatomy, physiology type stuff. This is part five. I don't like I said, this should be the last one. Now, this is covering, I say this every at the beginning of every lecture, it's covering some pretty intense material, so bear with me. My idea is to try to kind of bring you some high yield points and explain some things to you. So here we go. So it starts off with the central nervous system. The central nervous system really, as a whole, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. That's worth knowing. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. But as you should know, the brain controls the body. It tells it what to do. It takes a lot of input in, sends a lot of output out. It's, controls basically pretty much every being of our body is controlled by the brain. So now the book wants you to know some divisions of very, very, very basic brain anatomy that I want you to know as well. And so we'll break those down right here. So the first one, what's commonly called the gray matter of the brain, is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the biggest chunk of the brain, okay? And I'll highlight that here. All of this is cerebrum, okay? And cerebrum, and I'll show you on a future slide, divides into like different areas like temporal, parietal, frontal, occipital, right? But the cerebrum is the gray matter of the brain. Something I want you to know is this area of the brain is very, very soft, okay? If I were to take your brain out unpreserved, right? So not in formaldehyde, and hold it in my hands, it would collapse on itself. It's that fragile, right? It would collapse upon its own weight. So realize that the brain is very fragile, and I think sometimes when we see anatomy models or like cadaver labs or dissections, we think that the brain is like this hard, firm structure. It's not. The reason it looks like that when you see that is because it's been preserved in formaldehyde. Typically, the brain is very, very, very soft, okay? So that's just a distinction I want to make. Now, moving forward, the cerebellum is different than the cerebrum, and this is where students get messed up. The cerebellum down here is different than the cerebrum. They sound similar, they look similar on paper, but they're not. The cerebellum, when I say cerebellum, I want you to think this is the GPS of the brain, okay? So the cerebellum tells your body where it is in relation to itself. And I'll give you an example. When we drink alcohol, we get something called truncal ataxia, right? So our trunk, right, like our midline, gets messed up due to alcohol. And the reason that is because alcohol is toxic to the cerebellum. So what happens is, if you see people get pulled over, they ask them to walk heel toe, and this becomes really difficult when you're drunk to walk on a line because your brain doesn't know where where your foot is in relation to your body. So it becomes really difficult. Same thing with like the finger to nose test, right? So if I'm drunk, I may not be able to touch my finger to my nose with my eyes closed. But I'm not drunk right now, so I can do that pretty easily. But this is an example. The cerebellum is responsible for this fancy word called proprioception, right? Which tells your body your finger is in relation to your body. It's here in space, right? And again, alcohol messes this up, Parkinson's disease, kind of Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of disease, Huntington's disease. There's a lot of disorders that mess up the cerebellum. And trauma, of course, but there's a lot of disorders that'll mess this up. And if you just remember cerebellum with two L's, cerebellum is the GPS. You should be able to stumble your way through most exam questions with that. Now, the brainstem is a very important structure, obviously. So this is responsible for life. So the medulla oblongata, right, is stored up in here. So that's responsible for breathing and the cardiac and some cardiac stuff. But really, breathing is probably the most major function that runs through the brainstem. And when we start getting herniation of the brainstem, when we start having stuff pushed on the brainstem, it stops working. And when it stops working, patients die. So this is kind of a very important structure for life. Now, something I want to point out. The brainstem will dump down through here through this hole called the foramen magnum, right? This is like a hole down here. Just zoom in on this. Now, the important thing to realize is that almost every nerve runs through the brainstem, okay? So the nerves that are controlling my fingers and my toes and my gut and everything, they have to run through the brainstem. And so, as you can imagine, when there's a lesion or a cut, right, to the brainstem, or a tumor or trauma or bleeding to the brainstem, you die very quickly, or you have massive deficits. So the brainstem is probably like the last thing in your body that you want to get messed up. because it's so important for life and just regular function. Uh, One thing I'll point out too, this is the pons right here. The brainstem has really three sections, right? The midbrain, pons, and medulla. So um, you've probably heard before that if someone has a stroke on the right side of their brain, they have left-sided paralysis. And that's really weird. You're like, what? So that's not just a myth, really. The right side of the brain really does control the left side of the body. And the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So the reason that is because, as I said, all of these nerves have to pass through the brainstem. Well, for whatever reason, God decided to have this thing called decussation in the pons. So what happens is my right-sided nerve goes down into my brainstem and it crosses over and drops down into my left side and controls the left side of my body. So the reason why the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body is because decussation in the pons, they cross, they make an X pattern. And the right side will go to the left and the left side will go to the right. And that's why that happens. So if you've ever wondered why that is, I just explained it to you. And we see this a lot in stroke. So again, someone will have like a right-sided stroke and of their brain, so the right side of their brain died, but they have left-sided hemiparalysis, which is kind of an interesting dogma. Okay, now for whatever reason, so we'll run into this, but for whatever reason, the book tends to get a little bit excited about what specific lobes of the cerebrum do what, but it's really kind of intuitive with what these do. So now, again, cerebrum, gray matter, really big chunk of the brain. They're showing you, where's my pen? They're showing you, that's the big part, right? Okay, cerebrum. Now, there's more sections, but there's four sections that they want you to know. Let's start off with the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe controls like conscious executive thought, right? So this has a lot of like planning and emotion and thought, memory, things like that. They run through the frontal lobe, okay? And then we'll just jump over here to the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe, really hearing is probably the bigger thing here. There is some speech effects that happen here. This is very broad, guys, very, very broad. It's very made much more basic than it is, which is fine. That's the level of knowledge we need right now. The parietal lobe. So parietal is here, right? So like this. This is the parietal lobe. And so the parietal lobe is like, again, body awareness. There's a huge language and speech portion that runs through here. And then lastly, occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe of your skull is the very back, and vision is really important. So it's kind of weird that our eyes are way up here, but the cerebrum part that's controlling vision, it's in the occipital lobe. Okay, so again, the frontal lobe of the head, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Fun fact, if you want to know why they call it the temporal lobe, temporal means time. And time, this is one of the first places that we age. We get gray hair and we have balding. So they say that's how it's the temporal lobe. One thing I want to point out too, this becomes important when we talk about head trauma, but I'll plant the seed now, is the temporal, there's the bone right here called the pterion. It's very, very thin. So if someone gets punched in the temporal lobe, you're at a high risk of fracturing their skull because this is the thinnest part of the skull right here. So it's a bad place to get punched. There's also a big artery that runs up behind that can cause brain bleeding. So again, cerebellum equals, this is the GPS of the brain. This tells your body, where are my fingers in relation to myself? Okay, this tells it where your feet are, where your trunk is, where your head's at. It tells you where are these things in relation to my body. That fancy word is called proprioception, okay? Now, the brainstem, we talked about this. There's three different areas of the brainstem. I'll draw them for you. This is the midbrain. Whoops. This is the, oh my gosh. This is the pons, and this is the medulla, and this is the spinal cord, okay? Now, there's a lot of stuff happening in there, but again, there's no brainstem important for life. And let me tell you why this becomes important. I'll draw this out for you. If someone's having like a really, really like most catastrophic brain bleed, right? What happens is you can have brain tissue quite literally push onto the brainstem. And a general rule, anytime the brain gets pushed on or poked on or bled on, it doesn't do well. So it'll push itself down through the foramen magnum eventually. It's just the most severe case. And when the brainstem gets pushed on for whatever reason, it stops working or it doesn't work properly. So it's kind of worth knowing that. It's called herniation of the brain. Okay, that's an extreme case, but it's worth knowing. Now, moving forward, what is the central nervous system? Is it the brain or is it the brain and the spinal cord? It is the brain and the spinal cord. So here we have the cerebrum, which is the gray matter, the cerebellum, which is the GPS, the brainstem, and off of the brainstem will dump down into the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is just like a big chunk of nerves that will run through a cord, right, through the vertebra, and they have exterior branches. Now, at the exterior branches, when they come off of the spinal cord, that is now considered the peripheral nervous system, okay? Periphery meaning like to the outside. So it's worth knowing that, yes, the brain and the spinal cord are the central nervous system, but as soon as it juts off into the peripheral nerves, that's the peripheral nervous system. Now, this isn't a one-way highway, right? This is a two-way street. So it is sending information down from the brain, and it is also sending information from my fingers and toes and mouth and whatever up to the brain as well, okay? So it goes both ways. You're sending information down, information up. It's not just muscle information, it's sensory information, it's pain, it's proprioception, it's vibration, temperature. All these information pieces are being sent up and down this highway, from the brain down to the brain, so realize that. It's pretty intuitive, though. It's not a one-way highway there. Okay, let me move over here. Now, there's this thing called the meninges. So again, I told you the brain is very, very, very fragile. And the skull itself, by design, does protect the brain pretty well, right? But we also have these things called the meninges. And the meninges enclose the entire central nervous system, not just the brain. It's the brain and the spinal cord are wrapped around in these like almost like a thin leather casing that has fluid and these different layers that protect the brain. Okay, and occasionally on exams they will ask you what are the layers of the meninges. And an easy way to remember this is I'm telling you the meninges protect the brain, so you can remember the mnemonic PAD. P-A-D. So that's pia matter, that's arachnoid matter, and that's dura matter. So if you work your way from the brain up, from the brain it goes pia matter, arachnoid, and then dura matter. So it pads the brain. So occasionally examiners will go after that and say, what are the layers of the meninges in order? And you would know, from the brain going up to the skull, it goes pia, arachnoid, dura, pad. Okay, if you're working away from the skull down to the brain, it would be DAP, right? So it would be dura, arachnoid, pia. And that is worth knowing. It's not being fancy. You actually need to know that. Okay, now I hate when what's annoying about neurology is they use like really ancient terms and then they use new terms. Diencephalon is like a pretty ancient term, and it's like embryologic, right? It's just not a good word. But anyways, they use it in the book. So diencephalon, it's this area that has the thalamus, the subthalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus. And basically, when you hear the word thalamus, I want you to think like mood, sensory, it's really all three, like mood, sensory, body. It has a lot to do with like sensory regulation and input, output, and that feeds into movement as well. And sensory also feeds into mood. So it has a lot of different roles. And I just kind of like took a picture off of a slide. It's just kind of showing you here. I could use my laser, but like, it just kind of shows you this. It kind of comes up off of the midbrain, the top of the brainstem. And it has this really important role in like thermal regulation and hunger and satisfaction and sight and smell and actually not smell, it bypasses this, but there's a lot of different pieces of this that you really don't need to know a lot about. Just know that the diencephalon, if you could take one piece from me telling you this, if you hear the word diencephalon, you need to think thalamus, something. It's something to do with the thalamus. If they say diencephalon, it's the hypothalamus, epithalamus, subthalamus, thalamus. It's thalamus something has to do with the diencephalon, right? So that would be kind of the encryption that I would use. Diencephalon has something to do with the thalamus. Okay? Now, the limbic system, and it's really weird. I've seen this tested, like they just straight up ask, which of the following influences emotion, behavior, mood, motivation, pain, pleasure? It's the limbic system. Okay. It's made up of three parts, but basically you need to know that the limbic system is this system that regulates, for the most part, emotion. So it can make you really happy or really mad, or it could make you want to go sing karaoke or not sing karaoke. It has a lot to do with inhibition. So just be aware, the limbic system equals emotion. The limbic system equals emotion. I have straight up seen that tested on exams. I don't know why, but it happens. Okay? Limbic system equals emotion. And the limbic system is made up of several things, like the amygdala and stuff like that, but the limbic system equals emotion. So that was the central nervous system, a very, very, very brief explanation of it. But the peripheral nervous system, these are composed of those like nerve fibers that come up and off the spinal cord, okay? And I want you to know there's two portions of the peripheral nervous system, right? There's the somatic nervous system, right? Whoops. And then there is the autonomic nervous system. Now, somatic, when you hear the word somatic, you need to think that that's underneath voluntary control. So, like, for the most part, like your muscles are underneath somatic control. There's a lot of things under somatic control, things you control, right? And then there's the autonomic nervous system, right? So this is involuntary. So breathing, digestion, certain things that we don't really think about. But one thing I want to point out is these aren't completely dichotomous, right? So there is, like, for example, urination, right? You consciously can control when you urinate, but it also involves the autonomic or involuntary nervous system as well. Same thing with like defecation and certain like digestion and even breathing, right? So realize that they are distinct, but they're not dichotomous, right? There is overlap between the two within the body, okay? Now, I told you earlier, there's two types, there's more than, well, there's mainly two types of nerves in the peripheral nervous system, right? There's sensory and there's motor nerves. Sensory makes sense, right? So this is going to be pain, temperature, touch, fine touch, vibration, okay? All of these come back to the brain or the spinal cord in the brain through sensory nerves, okay? That's sensation, okay? And obviously, in like in our fingers, we have a lot of sensory compared to like my abdomen. I don't need a lot of sensory in my abdomen, but I need a lot of sensory in my hands or my face. Um, and then motor nerves makes sense. When you hear the word motor, you can't think of like a V8. I need you to think when you hear motor, I want you to think it's more like muscle. It's muscle movement. So motor nerves are going to control muscle, especially voluntary muscle. Okay. Okay. Whoops. So we have these things called spinal reflexes, and these are primitive, right? So they're designed to protect us. Okay, let me restart. They were designed originally to help us as infants, right? So you've probably seen like the rooting reflex. When you stroke an infant's cheek, they'll turn to try to latch onto a nipple. Or the Morrow reflex, right? When they fall and they reach out. Or the Babinski reflex or whatever. There's a lot of reflexes that children have that as we age, those go away. One. Two, as adults, we still have some reflexes. Like, for example, if you grab a hot stove, you will instantly pull back before your brain can even process what's happened. That is a reflex. If you're falling, you might try to catch yourself before your brain can even process what is happening. So there are some reflexes that we still have as adults, okay? And those are spinal reflexes. The thing that I want you to know is that we have some reflexes that will completely bypass the brain. They just go straight to the muscle and then they do what they got to do. Okay, and you've also seen us test these. We have some reflexes where, like, as physicians, if they like use a little, I don't have one with me, but a reflex hammer, right, to where they'll like, bang on your arm or on your wrist, and you kind of like jerk, right? Those are reflexes. Those are spinal reflexes, and there's a reason we test those. But just know that reflexes exist. Okay. Now, cranial nerves. There's 12 of them, and basically cranial meaning the head face, right? These are you don't need to memorize these. I don't think you do. They're complicated, but I'll run through them really quick so you just have a general idea. And what they've done right here is they've shown you the cranial nerves and where they're at on a section of the brain. So again, you don't need to memorize these, but I'm gonna at least tell you what they are so you can hear them once from me. Okay. So the olfactory bulb, which is cranial nerve one. Okay, and you'll notice they use Roman numerals when we talk about cranial nerves. The olfactory nerve has to do with smelling. So smelling is cranial nerve one. Cranial nerve two, right here. This is the optic nerve. So this isn't like eye movement or anything like that. This is straight up like sight coming in and sight going to my brain. That's optic nerve number two, or optic nerve, which is cranial nerve number two. Oculomotor. So this is how we move our eyes like up and down, and like how our pupils constrict and don't constrict. So that's oculomotor nerve. So it makes sense. Oculo, eye, motor, muscle. So these are the eye muscles. But it gets a little annoying because we have two more. The trochlear nerve, right? Cranial nerve four. This is if I want to like look to the left. That's how I was able to bring my right eye towards my nose. That's the trochlear nerve. And then trigeminal nerve. This is a sensory nerve. So basically it has three branches. So there's a branch right here, there's a branch right here, and there's a branch on my jaw. And so basically this is sensation of the face. Okay. So this is how I can feel someone touching my face. Okay. The abducens nerve. This is the nerve that allows me, like if I'm again using my right eye, if I want to look to the right, to convince my right eye to look to the right, that involves the trochlear or the abducens nerve, which is cranial nerve six. The facial nerve. This is this has to do with like facial muscles. Okay, so for me to like raise my eyes and muscles of mastication using my mouth, chewing, stuff like that, taste even runs through cranial nerve seven. There's a little bit of muscle in your ear, oddly enough, that runs through cranial nerve seven. This isn't, I will say the facial nerve becomes important because of a condition called Bell's palsy. We get paralysis of cranial nerve seven. So we see that occasionally. The vestibular cochlear nerve, this cranial nerve 8, this uses your ear. So this is obviously going to be auditory, hearing. It also has to do with balance and um, uh, like kind of how we keep our balance. We'll just keep it simple. It's how we keep our balance, how we know where we're at. The glossopharyngeal nerve, this is going to be your palate. It's going to be the back. Vagus nerves does a ton of stuff. The big thing is, again, it has to do with, for now, it has to do with swallowing. The hypoglossal nerve, this is going to be your tongue. It's cranial nerve 12. And then the spinal accessory nerve, this has to do with like when you raise your traps up. It's really weird that it's a spinal nerve, but it is. So it's cranial nerve 11. So anyways, those are the cranial nerves. There's 12 of them. I don't think you need to memorize them. If you do, that's pretty cruel of examiners because I think it's a little bit advanced. Okay. Now, there is this pattern of things called dermatomes. Dermatomes with an M, dermatome. And basically, these can be helpful because they tell us where a lesion can be. So I'll give you an example. If someone snaps their neck, okay, let's just say like they break their neck or back, I can feel on their body and say, do you feel this? Do you feel that? Do you feel this? Do you feel that? And figure out within a pretty good degree of certainty where the lesion's at within their brain or within their spinal cord. So that's kind of the idea of this. And you'll see it's labeled, right? Like, so like, let's just do T4, right? Which is the nipples, okay? So if someone has a lesion at T3, okay, and they can still feel their nipples, right, on physical exam, then that would be an example of like, oh, well, then we know the lesion's above here, okay? It's not at T4 because they can still feel their nipples and, you know, their chest, their abdomen, and blah, 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 and down. So it becomes kind of relevant in that when we use dermatomes. Again, I don't think you're expected to memorize these. Just know they exist, okay? Now, the eye, so the eyeball itself, like the ball, is called the globe. Kind of makes sense. And basically, conjunctiva will cover the inner surface of the eyelids and the exposed surface of the eye. So, you know, this is kind of like the outer layer of your eye that you feel. Okay. Really, the cornea is kind of where we'll, like if you ever like have scratched your eye, it's your cornea that gets scratched. Okay, and that hurts really bad. Now, behind the iris is the lens. So let's just zoom in on this and talk about it. So light comes in, okay, through the cornea, through this opening right here, which is the pupil. The iris right here, this is the colored part of your eye, by the way. So, you know, for me, I might have, I don't even know what color my eyes are. They're like a greenish color. So it's like that's your iris, okay? Um, and your pupil is the opening. That's the black hole in your eye that gets bigger and smaller. and there's a little muscle that controls this. So if you're in a dark environment, you need more light. So the pupil will open up and say, let more light in. If you're in a bright environment, you need less light coming into your eye, so it'll squeeze down. So that controls how much light comes in your eye, the opening of the pupil. And we assess this neurologically during the exam to see like, oh, are both pupils equally round and reactive to light? Because they should be. This pupil, even if I shine a light in this eye, this pupil, it's what's called consensual response, right? So this pupil, if this one dilates, the other one should dilate. If this one responds, they should both respond. What's pathology is if this one's really big and this one's really small. That's bad. That means someone has a lesion, some type of brain injury. It's really bad when that happens. So it's a problem. So we look for that in the pre-hospital environment when we take our little fancy pen lights and we're looking in people's eyes. Okay, that's what we're looking for. We're trying to make sure their pupils are equally round and reactive to light. Okay, and when it reacts to light, it should get smaller. Just explain that. So again, what happens is light will come in and it passes through this lens, like literally like my glasses lens. But the cool thing about the lens in our eyes is it can change shape to focus. Have you ever like looked at a wall and kind of like changed your focus of your eye to where the blurriness can change close and far, right? That's the change in your lens, okay? It can change shape a little bit to help us focus. It's called accommodation. So what happens is, again, light will come in, it passes through the lens, it goes through the vitreous chamber. This fluid in here is called aqueous humor, and hopefully it hits back here on this thing called the fovea. Okay, and this is where the majority of like vision takes place, but this whole back piece also plays into vision. Okay, it's called the retina. So this is the retina. Okay, and the retina and the fovea, they take light and they process it in a very complex way, and they shoot it to the brain, and that's how we see. This feeds down into the optic nerve and it goes to the brain. So that's just kind of the very basic anatomy of the eye. Yeah, so that's it for that. Okay, that's all we need to know on that. Now, moving on, the integumentary system, sophisticated. The integumentary system, which is the skin, right? Examiners love you to know what's the largest system in the human body. It's the integumentary system. It's the skin. We got a lot of skin on us. Okay, so basically, it does a lot of things. It has to do with thermal regulation to maintain our temperature. It protects us from pathogens. It protects us from trauma. It protects us from injury. It excretes some stuff. It does a lot. But really, the big thing is what they want you to know is it plays a crucial role in maintaining the constancy of the internal environment, also known as homeostasis. They love that word, homeostasis, which is the balance of life. So it maintains the balance of life, homeostasis. The skin does, okay? And we see this in pathology, right? So if someone gets burnt, well, I'll be dipped. What happens? They can't thermoregulate. They end up dumping fluid through their skin. They end up with sensory deprivation, right? So there's a lot of like issues that happen when we see pathology with skin. Okay. Now, there's 3 layers of the skin. We'll talk about this. You've probably heard of these before, but it's the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous tissue. If you don't know the medical terminology word for epi means like outer. So epi, outer, dermis. It's the outer dermis. It's the outermost dermis. So what you're looking at on your skin, right? That is the epidermis. Okay, and the epidermis is dead. Okay, you've probably heard that. It's not living cells per se, but down in the dermis, it is very much so living cells, and this is where like the nutrients and stuff come. So the epidermis is made up of layers of kind of like, I think I mean, they are dead, but it's made up of layers of skin cells. Okay, um, so the epidermis is the outermost, and so we'll jump ahead. If the epidermis gets destroyed, that's a 1st-degree burn. It's a sunburn. Okay, now if the dermis gets burned, that's a 2nd-degree burn or more. I'll put second or plus. If the subcutaneous tissue gets burned, that's a 3rd degree or more. Okay, so that's why EMT textbooks want you to know the different layers of the skin, because it presents different in pathology, right? So we know if you've ever had a really bad sunburn, you could have had blistering. Well, that means you burnt through the epidermis and the dermis, because blistering only happens when we have 2nd-degree burns. So you burnt the dermis. Okay, so I'm just giving you some examples, but I'll point out some structures in here. These are like vascular like capillaries, okay? And so these will jut up to the skin in these kind of like wave-like patterns. You see how there's like this wave-like pattern of the epidermis, okay? So up there's nerve endings, and there's also like capillaries. Okay. Um, we have this is a hair follicle. We'll just talk about this real quick. Attached to a hair follicle is something called a sebaceous gland. Excuse me. Sebaceous glands secrete oil. Okay, and this helps with like hair follicle maintenance. Keeps the hair like kind of moistened. Um, and then there's this actually a muscle called the erector pili. Okay, and basically what happens is if you've ever had goosebumps, these are literal muscles attached to the hair follicle that cause them to stand up. So as you can imagine, when muscles contract, they get smaller. So if this gets smaller, it's going to cause the hair to stand up. Okay. This is a sweat gland. Okay. So this will release fluid, salt, up through the skin. It causes thermal regulation through evaporation, conduction. Okay. Or I'm sorry, convection. Let's see what else. And then down here we have fat. You know, I was shocked the first time I went to a cadaver lab, and well, I've seen this in the field too, but the first time you see someone's actual fat, it really does look like these little droplets. It's really weird. And they'll have little droplets up underneath their skin, and it's like it's yellow and it feels like fat. So, anyways, that's kind of interesting. It really does look like that. Now, below this, when we get into the subcutaneous tissue, there's this thing called fascia. That's this word right here. It's spelled weird. Fascia. And basically, this is like a little thin, very fibrous, almost leather-like material that sits on top of muscle. Okay, and then obviously there's muscle below that. So this is the integumentary system. Okay, some basic anatomy. So again, the major functions of the skin: protect the body from the environment, heat, cold, trauma, scratches, stickers, bites, whatever. Okay, whoops. Regulate body temperature and also transmits environmental information back up to the brain. Okay, so it's the major organ for regulation of body temperature. And again, when we get burned, this gets compromised, so this becomes a big issue that we have to worry about as EMTs. Okay, the digestive system, very, very complex, very important. And oddly enough, we see a decent amount of pathology with this, right? Pancreatitis, cholecystitis, cholelithiasis, constipation, diverticulitis, cancer, hepatobiliary disease, like liver disease, all these issues, gastric ulcers that just run through the gut. Okay, lots of pathology that we run into in EMS, and it's a very common complaint. My belly hurts. I'm vomiting. I have diarrhea. I'm pooping blood. Like whatever. We get a lot of these complaints, so it is worth knowing the anatomy and physiology of these. Okay, so the GI tract, it's really okay, it's in there. Good. It's yeah, it is. I wish this would be in order, right? It's the mouth, esophagus, stomach, intestines, salivary glands, pharynx, gallbladder, pancreas, rectum, and anus. Okay, and basically we use these through digestion. So digestion actually starts in your mouth with mastication, right, with chewing, and our salivary glands release some chemicals that'll start breaking down food, and it travels down our esophagus, which is the food tube. So the front tube you're feeling right here, that's actually your trachea. Behind your trachea is this little soft tube that when we swallow, it opens up, but normally it's kind of collapsed on itself like this. Whoops, like this. And we swallow, gulp, and then it comes back down. It collapses on itself. So that's the esophagus. Okay. Students get lost on how to spell this. Esophagus. Okay. And so basically, it goes through the esophagus, down into the stomach. And the stomach, we start releasing a ton of chemicals, really acid. A lot of acid is there, some pepsinogen, things that break down protein and fat and carbohydrates, and then it'll bump down to the duodenum, the small intestine, travels through the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, and then it'll dump into the colon, right? And it goes ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, anus, right? And then we poop it out. So that's kind of the brief overview of how we eat, or when we eat, what happens to food. And of course, all throughout that pathway, digestion's occurring, and really through the intestines, especially, a lot of absorption is taking place. So we're converting your Taco Bell into usable food in the form of carbohydrates, amino acids, proteins, starches, sugars, and we're using that and we're absorbing that to be used throughout the body. So that's kind of the idea that's happening there. Okay. Now the abdomen, it's really it's divided into several quadrants, really, but yeah, I'll talk about this real quick. Um, uh, the abdominal cavity has two areas, and the book doesn't spend a lot of time talking about this, but there's the peritoneal cavity, right, which is like this upper section. like that. And then in the back section, like back here, there is the retroperitoneal space. So the kidneys, part of the colon, part of the pancreas, they all run through the retroperitoneal space, okay? And the reason it becomes important is because we see different patterns of bleeding. If someone gets shot right here, right, we might see bleeding only in the retroperitoneal or the peritoneal space. If someone gets a baseball bat to the kidneys, they're going to bleed in the retroperitoneal space, and it's so it creates these different patterns of bleeding and bruising that we can use clinically. So, um, yeah, let's talk about this actually. So, this is just simple anatomy. Um, this is the pancreas. To me, the pancreas almost looks like a gun. But basically, the pancreas, we're going to talk about the pancreas, but basically it dumps a lot of digestive juices into the duodenum. And this is the duodenum. The duodenum is the first part of the the small intestine. So it comes off of the stomach is the duodenum, and then the jejunum, and then the ileum, and then it dumps into the large intestine, the colon. Now, I want to point out that I call it the duodenum, but it could also be called the duodenum. So be aware that both are right. Duodenum or duodenum. I recommend you pick one and stick with it, but both are correct. Okay? Now, here are our kidneys, and on top of our kidneys are these structures called the adrenal glands. These don't have to do anything with digestion, but they do have a lot to do with like the endocrine system. And so kidneys, obviously, this is where urine is created. We filter our blood, urine is created, and then it shoots down into your ureters, into the bladder, and then through the penis is the urethra, and then we have excretion. Okay. Now, mouth, cheek, I mean, y'all should know this, right? So the mouth contains the lips, cheeks, gums, teeth, and tongue. Who knew? And then the salivary glands. Okay. Now, I will say the oropharynx, this is the back of the mouth. And the reason this is important is we use a tool as an EMT called the oropharyngeal airway. And it's this thing that I don't have one with me that lifts up the tongue, and it kind of touches the back of the palate, like your back of your throat, to lift up the tongue. So we use this in like cardiac arrest and stuff. Now, esophagus, again, this is the food tube that goes from your mouth down to your stomach, okay? It's behind your trachea. Your trachea is this hard one that you feel up front. You can't feel your esophagus. It's behind the trachea. Now, the stomach, this is this right here. So look, I'm going to take your attention over here. This is the esophagus coming in, right? Right here's a little sphincter. Sphincters are little like round muscles. And it dumps into the stomach. The stomach looks like this. It does kind of sit on the left side of your body. That is true. But I want you to know stomach pain is felt mid-epigastric. Let me drop my camera. It's felt right here, okay? Yes, the stomach does sit a little bit mostly on the left side, but if someone has stomach pain, almost always you will feel it right here, okay? You've probably experienced that. So moving forward. The stomach, obviously, there is mechanical forces at play here. The stomach does chime on itself, and it creates mechanical force to break down food and process it. It is releasing an incredible amount of acid that's very acidic. It's releasing pepsinogen, trypsinogens, lipase, amylase. All these things are getting released from different organs to help break down your Taco Bell into something useful so your body can use it, okay? So be aware, there's more than just a chemical process taking place. There's also a mechanical process taking place in the stomach, okay? Over here is this really interesting organ called the pancreas. The pancreas, a very useful organ. Let's talk about this structure. Let me just zoom in. It'll be easier if I just zoom in. So this right here is the pancreas, okay? And it actually looks like that. And over here is the tail of the pancreas. This is where a lot of stuff is produced for like diabetes, right? And if you have diabetes, this is what's messed up, the tail. So like insulin, you've probably heard of that. Glucagon, somatostatin, these are produced over here. And you'll notice that there's like, there's like this little highway of tubes, kind of like ducts. These are ducts, D-U-C-T-S, ducts, that dump the excretions of the pancreas into the duodenum. So the food that you just ate in your stomach, it travels through the duodenum right here, right? If this is your stomach, okay? It dumps in through to the duodenum, and it meets up with some old pals, right? Amylase, lipase, trypsin, just amylase and lipase are the bigger ones, that dump into the duodenum, and further digestion takes place here. So this is a hot area of pathology. I'm going to explain why here in a second. Okay, so that is the pancreas. So what does the pancreas do? I'll recapitulate. It's an endocrine organ, as in it dumps straight into the veins and arteries, really arteries. It dumps straight into arteries with insulin, glucagon, somatostatin. 1. Two, it's an exocrine organ. It secretes amylase to break down carbohydrates and lipase to break down fat in your Taco Bell. What it does is it dumps down into these ducts, okay, into the duodenum. It's the third part of the duodenum. The second part of the duodenum, actually. In through these ducts, okay? So that's one thing that happens. One thing I want to point out is this very pesky little organ called the gallbladder. So the liver produces this stuff called bile. And what bile does is it emulsifies fats. So I hate salad, but I like vinaigrettes. If you've ever had like a vinaigrette, if you shake it up, instead of being like a layer of oil and a layer of vinegar, it emulsifies. And that process is called emulsification. And emulsification is when you have a bunch of little bitty fat droplets suspended on each other. So what happens in our body is the liver will produce this stuff called bile, and it stores it in the gallbladder. And when we eat a bunch of refried beans and tamales, which has a lot of fat in it, fried food, whatever you want to go to State Fair, have some fried food, it will dump through the stomach into the duodenum. And what happens is this chemical is released and it says, oh, there's a lot of fat in here. We need to release bile to emulsify this fat. So what happens is the gallbladder will quite literally squeeze down on itself and it releases that, it's green in color. So if you've ever thrown up so much you're throwing up green, that's bile. It will release this bile into the duodenum and it emulsifies fat. So imagine those tamales and refried beans in your gut. They're getting emulsified, like shaking up the vinaigrette, and it's making this food more digestible. That's the action of bile. That's why we have bile. Now, of course, there's pathology when we get stones in here. And so especially fat females that are fertile and over 40, it's called the 4Fs, they will get gallstones in here, and we have to go in here and surgically remove their gallbladder because it's causing them like a lot of pain when they eat fat food. So this is kind of like some general pathology stuff to try to hopefully solidify some basic anatomy, but very relevant that we talk about and so that's the gallbladder. Also, the pancreas. I told you it has this really gnarly stuff called lipase and amylase, and so sometimes when we drink way too much alcohol, if these get blocked off or there's this unknown reason why, the pancreas will literally start digesting itself, and that's a condition known as pancreatitis. It's rather lethal, extremely painful, and we see this most commonly in alcoholics. And so basically the pancreas will literally, I mean, imagine this, literally start self-digesting itself while you're alive. Yeah. So it creates this terrible triad in pathology for patients. And like I said, it's very lethal. So that's called pancreatitis. So, and I guess while we're talking about pathology, I shouldn't even be jumping into these, but I hope it helps. There's a condition called cholecystitis. Okay, so cholecystitis is when we get like fever and inflammation of the gallbladder or this area right here, and that's when those stones become infected, and that's when it becomes an emergency. And there's this other word called cholelithiasis, which is when we just have stones in there. So anyway, lots of pathology on this. We'll talk about that in GI pathology, but I'm just trying to lay a foundation for you. All right, moving over here. So the liver, very important structure. I want you to know the liver sits in your right upper quadrant. In fact, if you're skinny, you might be able to feel the bottom of your liver. It hangs out right below your rib cage sometimes. So you could like take I can feel my liver right there. It hurts when you grab it. So if you take like a breath in, it pushes your guts down, right? Your diaphragm will go down and you can like kind of hook your liver. So anyways, that's where your liver's at. Sits on the right side. It's a rather large organ. I can't show you how big it is, but on myself, I mean, like, it's big. It's a big organ, and it's solid, okay? It's a solid organ. And remember, the gallbladder sits within the liver because the liver produces bile, but it is stored in the gallbladder. So test question, where is bile produced? In the liver. Where is it stored? In the gallbladder, okay? The gallbladder does not produce bile. It stores bile. Very important. So the liver, basically, let me go to this picture right here. We're going back. I want to point out a little something. Anytime you eat something, okay, whether it's pills like medicine or Taco Bell or pizza or whatever, it all, it comes through your esophagus, down into your stomach, into the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, blah, blah, blah. So this area right here and down all the way almost to your rectum, okay? It actually all the way down to the rectum. It all feeds back. So all of your digestive guts feed back through this one vein. called the portal vein. And they, well, cool. They don't, oh yeah, no, they don't even have it labeled on here. Cool. Well, shout out. But imagine there's a big vein running right up into the liver. This is why I'm telling you this. Every time we eat something and digest something, it has to go to the liver first for digestion and processing. So all the medicine that you just took, all the toxins, all the drugs, all the whatever you just ingested, poison, whatever, it goes to the liver through the portal vein. Okay? It's processed in the liver and then it goes out through the liver into the heart and then it goes through the rest of the body. So the liver really serves as a detoxification organ. It does a lot of detox. It processes a lot of materials. Now, the liver also forms blood clotting factors. So people that have liver disease have clotting factor issues. So like alcoholics, people with cirrhosis, hepatitis, right? They have clotting factor issues. This becomes relevant. For example, when an alcoholic falls over drunk and cracks their head, you have to be worried that they don't have the proper clotting factors. So they're at a higher risk of head bleeding. This is an important thing. So the liver produces proteins and it packages material and it detoxifies material. It produces clotting factors. It produces some endocrine, maybe not a lot of it, really no, well, maybe a little endocrine stuff. It's kind of off. But when you think liver, I want you to think detoxification. That's the most important thing we can do. And I'll point this out why this is important. Alcoholics have messed up livers. Why is that? Alcohol is toxic. So in high doses. So when we're drinking a lot of alcohol, what's the organ that gets wrecked out first? It's the liver, because the liver has to process all that alcohol. So we get cirrhosis, which is hardening of the liver. So we see all this pathology that happens in the liver. So be aware. I also want to point out the liver is very vascular, as you can imagine. Every bit of your guts feed its blood up into the liver. Holy cow, that's a lot of blood. So if we get trauma to the liver, like a baseball bat or a car into the liver or a steering wheel into the liver or a gunshot to the liver, very bad things happen because it's so vascular. It's very hard to manage these. Just be aware. That's the liver, very important organ. Where is it located? Where's the liver located? Draw it on yourself. It's the right upper quadrant. Got to know that. Okay. Now, the small intestines, you got to know it's the DJI, duodenum, jejunum, ileum. Oh no, not my laser, but DJI is how I remember that. I still remember that to this day. After all these years, I still think DJI. So DJI, and if I remember right, I think there's a drone, like DJI drone, right? So maybe that'll help someone who's like into drones. I don't know. But this is where we absorb food, but not just straight up Taco Bell, right? It's the carbohydrates, the amino acids, the fats, the lipids, right? Iron, vitamins, right? This happens in different sections of the duodenum, but nutrients, like proper nutrients, is absorbed here. Everything else, it makes its way down the highway and you eventually poop it out. But this is where absorption takes place, okay? Food absorption, especially. So not a whole lot of water is absorbed here. That's really in your gut, okay? Now, in the large intestine, which is, do I have a, yeah. This is the large intestine. So let me just show you this, and then I'll go back to the previous slide. So remember, the small intestine goes duodenum, jejunum, ileum, okay? And it dumps into the small or the large intestine, okay? So the right here is the ileum, okay? And the ileum will dump into the large intestine. And in the large intestine, this little like pocket down here, they love you to know this is called the cecum. This word right here, cecum. Okay, it's the cecum. It's like this little cup thingy. Okay, that's called the cecum. And off of the cecum runs the appendix. I'm going to come back to the appendix. Okay, but we go from the ileum to the cecum. From the cecum, we go up. So it's the ascending colon, and then we take a turn, and it's the transverse colon, and then we take another turn, and it's the descending colon, and then it makes this weird S shape, right? Called the sigmoidal colon. And then this is the rectum, and here's the anus, okay? So there's different like pathologies and stuff that happen along the way. I don't want to keep talking about pathology and overwhelm you, but this is very important to know this order. Straight up, it'll come to you on an exam or quiz. What's the order from the ileum to the rectum? All right, you're gonna have to know it's the ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, rectum, anus, poop. Okay, so that's the order that it goes. You have to know that. Okay, Now, let me scroll back over here. Now, the large intestine really, its main thing is it absorbs. I want you to know that it makes the stool solid. So when we drink our Dr. Pepper and Taco Bell or Baja Blast, shout out, and Taco Bell, it's very watery. And so we absorb a lot of water in the colon, in the large intestine. And you've heard me say colon, large intestine, they're interchangeable. Okay. So colon, also known as the large intestine. Okay. So that is the picture of that there. Now, the appendix, this is what's called a vestigial structure. We don't really use this anymore. We don't really know. We think it was, like gizzards, like fried gizzards on chickens. We think that this was used originally to help process when we ate a lot of grass. I mean, centuries and centuries ago. But it's this little structure. It's about the size of a pinky, and it hangs off the cecum on your right lower quadrant. Okay, I've had appendicitis, so if I lift my shirt, I'm not. I have a scar here, right? Because what happens is this can become inflamed. And so what happens is, actually, I'll tell you exactly what happens. Poop will get stuck here. If it's called a fecalith, it will get stuck here. And so a general pathology rule, when you block a highway of something, it gets inflamed. When it becomes inflamed, it becomes infected. When it becomes infected, you get fever, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. And then they have to go in there and surgically remove this. So they go in there and they just chop this puppy off, and then you're good to go. So this happens. It's fairly common pathology. It has a predictable set of symptoms. We'll talk about that in GI. But I'm just pointing out, that's the appendix, okay? Where is the appendix located? The right lower quadrant. The appendix is located in the right lower quadrant. Got to know that. Okay. Why is that important? Because if you have a male my age with right lower quadrant pain, you need to think appendicitis. If you have a female with right lower quadrant pain, you need to think appendicitis, ectopic pregnancy, ovarian cyst, right? A lot of lady parts are down there as well. So it becomes really a lot more difficult with females when they have abdominal pain, especially lower abdominal pain. Okay. Now, the rectum, this is at the end, right? So here, obviously, it comes off the sigmoid. And so it holds the feces until it's expelled. Now, interesting, feces really doesn't, normally, it doesn't stay here until it's time to go. And what happens is this will fill up, and there's a sphincter and a sensory area there that will say, oops, I got to go. And it keeps you from saying, oops, I just went. So there's two sphincters that work together. And remember, a sphincter is a round muscle, that it stays closed normally, and when you poop, it'll open up. Okay, and when you're done pooping, it goes closed. So we have sphincters in the rectum and anus. We have sphincters in our esophagus. We have sphincters in our duodenum. Remember what I was telling you, where we dump all those digestive enzymes, right? So we have a lot of different areas where we have sphincters. Okay, but when you hear sphincter, I want you to think round muscular thing that when stimulated, it'll open up, and when it's not, it'll close off. Okay, you got to know that. So it controls the escape of liquids, gases, and solids. So sometimes, you got to let a little air out. Not me, just kidding. Smells like roses. So the digestive system physiology. So I told you all this, and I'm not going to explain it to you again. Now, moving forward, the endocrine system, very, 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 very complex. We're going to talk about all the pathologies of this in its whole own chapter, but we'll lay a little bit of foundation here. So I'm just going to point these out, actually. It'll be easier. So, test question. Whoops. The hypothalamus belongs to which portion of the brain? The mesencephalon, diencephalon, or the brainstem? Remember, hypothalamus, thalamus, also known as the diencephalon, okay? So thalamus equals diencephalon. So the hypothalamus has a lot to do with, it produces a lot of not neurotransmitters, endocrine stuff, like gonadotropin releasing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, or thymoid releasing hormone, all these different things that you really don't need to know right now. So the hypothalamus produces endocrine stuff, and it goes down to this itty bitty, it's about the size of a pea structure called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is stores. It doesn't produce, it stores. Well, actually it does. The front part does. It stores and produces, I'll say both. I'll stand corrected. Let me restart. The pituitary gland both stores and produces, for the most part, endocrine stuff. Okay, so it'll dump it into the blood when it's time. Okay, now the pineal gland, that's also this very small gland back here. The pineal gland, it has to do with like sleep regulation. So like melatonin, you've probably heard of melatonin. It's produced there. So anyways, going forward, the thyroid and parathyroid, right? So we can feel these right here on ourselves. The thyroid you can feel. You can't really feel the parathyroids because they lie behind it. But the parathyroid, has to do with like calcium regulation. That's the big thing. So when you think parathyroid, I want you to think calcium, okay? Bone health, okay? Calcium and bones, makes sense. Thyroid has to do with what's called the basal metabolic rate. So the thyroid itself determines how hot is this machine going to run. It determines your temperature, your energy level, your blood pressure, your heart rate. It literally, so if you think of the word basal, meaning the lower level or like the normal level of your metabolism, so the thyroid hormone, right, determines at what level is your metabolism going to run. So if someone has hyperthyroidism, their metabolism is going to run too high. If someone has hypothyroidism, their metabolism will run too low. And that produces a predictable set of signs and symptoms. We'll talk about that later, but it's worth knowing. Okay. The thymus, this is really in children. This is where T cells go to mature. Don't need to know a bunch about that right now. The adrenals, they sit on top of the kidneys. Okay. Pancreas, we talked about that. What's produced in the pancreas? As far as the endocrine system goes, remember endocrine dumps straight into vessels. It's non-ducted. Excuse me, I'll say that again. Endocrines dump straight into the vessels. It does not travel through a duct, okay? So the tail of the pancreas produces glucagon, insulin, somatostatin, and those are used for blood sugar regulation, okay? The ovaries and the testes, again, these are part of the endocrine system, and the ovaries will produce progesterone and estrogen, and then the testes will produce testosterone, obviously. The adrenals produce testosterone in both males and females. So it's just a very, very brief overview of what these are. Okay, so we'll move forward. So this is complicated, but hang with me. This is a hallmark of pharmacology and pathophysiology. There's a lot of videos on this, so let me be very clear. If you don't understand what I'm about to tell you when I finish, you need to stop what you're doing, pause this video, and type in agonist versus antagonist on YouTube and figure this out. Very, very important. I can't stress this enough. If you don't understand this, you're not going to make it through the course. Okay, so you do need to understand that this is most pharmacology that we use works on this principle that I'm about to explain. So let me just draw this out for you. This is a cell, right? Okay, and who cares what this cell does? Okay, we'll just act like it's a pancreas cell and it produces insulin. Okay, and on this cell we have receptors, and in this case it looks like a football goalpost, but it could be any shape, size, whatever. Okay, but this is very simplified. And what happens is we have these things called agonists. Okay, so an agonist is a molecule that binds to a receptor and triggers a response by that cell. So let me show you what this looks like. So when we get a certain signal, what that signal is isn't important. It's floating around in the blood. It looks like this. Here's another one, and here's its twin. When it binds to this receptor, it sends a message through this receptor into the cell, and it says, yo, cell, do work. In this particular case, this cell is a beta cell of the pancreas, and it says, all right, cool, I'm going to do my work. I'm going to release my insulin. And so when it does its work, it does something. It releases insulin or glucagon, or it fires a nerve, or it blocks pain, or whatever it does, okay? Almost every cell has receptors, okay? And it depends on what the cell's job is what work it'll do, okay? So an agonist is when something in the blood is floating around and it perfectly matches this receptor. It binds to that receptor and it travels down that receptor and says, yo, cell, do your job, do your work, whatever that work is, okay? And then there's this other guy called an antagonist. So, all right, same cell. Who cares what the cell is? Doesn't matter. But we have a receptor that looks like this. And what happens is when you have an antagonist, let's say this is a drug called Narcan. You ever heard of naloxone, Narcan? It's an EMT drug. And it's floating around in the body. We just gave it through our IV. And it's like, oh, heck yeah, I fit onto this receptor. Made my day. So what happens is when it fits onto this receptor, it blocks that receptor to where now, since it's an antagonist, it can't do its work. So what happens is when you have like morphine or fentanyl or something like that floating around in the blood, it goes boink, boink. It can't get past that antagonist. The antagonist has taken that receptor and it has blocked that cell from doing work. Because as much as this fentanyl would love to jump onto the cell and block the pain receptors, it can't because naloxone has been bound to that receptor to where now doesn't matter how much Narcan's in the blood. It's like it's bouncing off because this receptor has been occupied by the antagonist. So you're like, damn, Hunter, Why do I need to know this? Well, it's because, I mean, I'm not kidding you. Almost every single drug we use as physicians or as paramedics or nurses or whatever, they act on this principle of agonist and antagonist. Okay? It's very important to understand this. Um, with that said, so does our endocrine system. We have things that block receptors like somatostatin. We have things that activate receptors, epinephrine, glucagon, insulin, and then counteract each other. And there's all this constant flow that's happening. So I'm going to recapitulate this. Okay. Agonists act on a receptor, but they tell the cell, do your job, do work, whatever that work is. Okay. As opposed to an antagonist, they still act on cell receptors. That's where students get lost. I'll say it again. Antagonists still work on cell receptors, but they block the cell from doing its job. So when they're sitting on that receptor and that receptor's taken up, it doesn't matter what comes along floating by. That receptor's taken up. They're in a relationship. Nothing else can happen. So it won't allow the cell to do work. Okay? So agonist tells the cell to do work. Antagonists block the cell from doing work. Whatever that work is, depends. Very complicated slide that I don't even want to explain, but I will. Hypothalamus, also part of the diencephalon. Okay, third time I've said that. It'll get stimulation. Okay, the hypothalamus does, and so does the anterior pituitary. Jesus. And I want you to know the pituitary gland is very, very small. It's about the size of a pea. Okay, so it's a very important structure for how small it is. And what happens is, depending on what the body needs it to do, stuff will be released from the hypothalamus and it goes down the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary will release what it needs to do. So if you need to produce testosterone, you might release this stuff called gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? Or LH, which then releases LH or FSH. Okay. Or if you need to produce, aldosterone, right? You might release adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? Or if you need to have thyroid hormone released, you'll release this stuff called thyroid stimulating hormone, okay? Or if you need bone growth, or any type of growth really, you'll release growth hormone or melanocyte stimulating hormone, right? MSH, right? Melanocytes gives us our skin color. So in freckles or brown or black colored people or white people, they have a lot more melanin being produced, okay? Prolactin. So the word pro means to promote lactation. So promote lactation goes to the mammary glands and it tells you to release milk. Okay. This can still happen in men, by the way. And kidney, so we use this stuff called antidiuretic hormone. So it releases vasopressin, essentially, ADH. So it goes to the collecting tubules of the kidneys and it says, hey, hold on to water or release water or whatever needs to happen based on the stimulus. Okay. And then oxytocin. So you've heard of this chemical. It produces uteral contraction. So it tells the uterus squeeze down. And it also produces the letdown of milk. It's also sometimes considered the love hormone. So it causes bonding when we touch people, especially babies. So anyways, I'm just letting you know, these are all the endocrine hormones. Your book will go into great detail on these, but just have a general idea of these. You're not going to get like pounded on these on the National Registry, but again, we got to kind of lay a foundation as medical professionals on these. Okay. I showed you the thyroid gland. Remember, it's up here. So I will say the thyroid gland does secrete calcitonin, but which attenuates, it kind of slows down this whole we need calcium stuff compared to the parathyroid glands, which sit behind the thyroid. There's 4 of them. They are sampling the blood, yum, 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 and it's like, we need some calcium. So what happens is it tells these little through a long process, it tells these Pac-Man guys in your bones called osteoclasts, chew up some bone and release some calcium into the blood, and that's what happens. It's one of the ways this happens. There's 3 ways this happens, but that's the easy version, okay? So again, I want to say this again. Thyroid hormone, I want you to think basal metabolic rate. How fast is the body working, okay? Whether it's temperature, heart rate, excitability, digestion, all these issues. The parathyroid, when you think parathyroid, I want you to think calcium. Calcium equals parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid glands, they're working, if we have too much or too little calcium, that's what they're kind of working on. And yeah, we'll stop with that. That's what you need to know on that. We talked about the pancreas quite a bit. I won't hit this a lot more. I don't know at the EMT level if they get real excited if you need to know the alpha, beta, delta stuff. But the alpha cells secrete glucagon. Glucagon this is complicated. Glucagon is released when we have low blood sugar, okay? and it tells your body to release this stuff called glycogen. And glycogen is broke down into glucose. And glucose is used for energy. So it's a really complex, right? Glycogen, or I'm sorry, glucagon to glycogen to glucose. Ugh, annoying. But that's how that works. They're secreted by the alpha cells, and it's over here in the head of, or the tail of the pancreas. And then beta cells, these secrete insulin. So insulin is kind of the key. So you know, like a door that has a lock on it, right? You have to have a key to open that door to go in. Well, insulin is kind of the key to a cell. It kind of opens the door and allows glucose to go into the cell. And without that key, glucose typically cannot get inside cells. So that's why we need insulin. It opens up the cellular door to allow glucose to go into the cell. Okay. And then delta cells, they secrete this stuff called somatostatin. When you hear somatostatin, I want you to, worst stop sign ever, but I want you to think of a stop sign, okay? Somatostatin, stop sign, somatostatin, stop sign. So somatostatin kind of shuts off the endocrine system, especially these two. So somatostatin shuts off the endocrine system by design, right? And those are the delta cells. Yeah, I won't show you you don't need to know that. We're getting towards the end, guys. I know this is a long one. Trust me. So the adrenal glands, these are endocrine system hormones, and they sit on top of each kidney. Okay, and they're like this. They really are yellowish. Okay, and what they do is they have a big role in first epinephrine and norepinephrine production. Okay, that's a big role that they do. So when you see a state trooper behind you and you feel that dump of adrenaline, it's there. Okay, that's happening. And so these are endocrine. What is endocrine? It dumps straight into the vessels. It's not ducted, okay? So these are endocrine glands. So epinephrine and norepinephrine is produced here specifically, if you want to get real fancy, in the medulla, in the adrenal medulla or medulla, okay? Medulla, same thing. And then I want to point out too, the adrenal cortex produces like aldosterone, sex hormones, mineralocorticoids. Okay, so if you ever wonder, like, oh, females have testosterone, they do. It's produced there in the adrenal cortex. Okay, so they produce mineralocorticoids, aldosterone, sex hormones. Those are the big ones. So I'm pointing this out because these become really important for endocrinology. Okay. Now, I guess I'm going to come up here. Whoops. No, I'll go over here. Okay. So there is these. Okay, let me just start with this. Oh my God, you're in EMT school. We have to talk about penises and vaginas. So a kind of a pet peeve of mine is when and I get it's like a nervous laugh, but students like chuckle at this. You have to realize you are stepping into the healthcare field where we do talk about penises and vaginas, and we have to look at them and touch them professionally. You know, so just be aware, like you're walking into healthcare now, so you have to look at penises and vaginas as just folds of skin, right? In human anatomy, you have to desexualize these things. You really do, because that's what our profession says we need to do, and this is a sacred profession. So again, I know every time I talk about this to students, someone snickers. I get it. It's uncomfortable for some, whatever. But I'm telling you, you're going to see people's penises and vaginas and breasts and rectums and anuses, and you're going to see these things, and you have to desexualize these. You have to realize these are people that need our help. We are professionals. They are trusting us with the sacredity of these positions. They are very vulnerable, and you have to realize that it's just folds of skin. It's all folds of skin eventually, okay? So just look at it like that. These are just folds of skin, no different from an armpit or an elbow. It's what it is, okay? So moving forward. The reproductive system, very complex. This has its own chapter, so we'll just we'll lay some general foundation now. But the male reproductive system, okay, so in males, the reproductive glands or the gonads are the testicles. Okay, men have two testicles, sit within the scrotum. And then within females, it's the ovaries. So, we kind of default as humans to female anatomy. And in men, with the Y gene, it'll produce testicles and a penis. But what happens is, what I'm trying to say is the ovaries and testicles embryologically are very, very, very similar. Okay, so you could almost imagine ovaries as female testicles, and you could imagine the testicles as male ovaries, right? They're sex producing. They produce hormones. They produce what we need for fertility. So they're very similar in that regard. That's what I'm trying to point out. And those are called gonads, okay? So testosterone is the major androgen manufactured by the testes. Where else is testosterone produced? The adrenal glands. Yeah, the adrenal cortex specifically. So, but in men, we have a lot more testosterone because of testicles. And then in females, we have really three major female hormones. So it's progesterone, estrogen, and HCG, which is human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay. So if you've ever heard of someone urinating on a pregnancy test, what are we testing for? We're testing for HCG. Okay. That's an HCG test. Because when someone gets pregnant, about 7 to 10 days after fertilization, you can pee on a stick, right, and it'll test for HCG in the urine, and then that's a pretty good indicator that someone's pregnant. Okay, so we'll just zoom in on this, and I'll cover some real quick anatomy. So we'll start with the testicles here. Whoops. We'll start with the testicles here. So obviously these sit within. Let me use my laser. They sit within the scrotum. So sperm is actually produced in this thing called the epididymis. So if this is a testicle, the epididymis sits on top of it, of a testicle, and sperm is actually produced there, and it's stored kind of within the testicles, okay? And then it travels up this thing called the vas deferens. So if you've ever heard of a vasectomy, they cut this highway to where sperm can't come out anymore. And then it goes through, around through the bladder into the prostate. And then when ejaculation occurs, a bunch of stuff will empty through the seminal vesicles, and it'll mix in the prostate, and then it'll come out through the penis, and ejaculation occurs. Okay, so that's kind of just basic male anatomy. Okay, the ureters sit back here. Remember, ureters are back here, and the urethra is like the penis. Okay, so students get the word ureter and urethra confused, and it'll make you bomb a test question. Okay, you got to know the difference between those. Ureters sit in the back. Urethra is the penis. It's the tube through the penis. Okay, now we'll talk real quick about female anatomy. So obviously the vaginal opens right here. This is the cervix. The word cervix means neck, okay? And the reason it's called neck is because this is like the neck of the uterus, okay? And so here's the cervical opening, cervical os, right? And then this is the vagina, or I'm sorry, vagina. This is the uterus, and off of the uterus are the fallopian tubes, and then here are the ovaries. And so what happens is when a female is fertile, an egg will mature in the ovary. It'll get sucked up into these little finger-like structures called the fimbriae, and then sperm will mix with it right here, and then it'll come down through the fallopian tubes. Fertilization actually typically occurs right about here, and then it'll implant onto the uterus, and that's where a baby will grow. So just again, some very, very basic anatomy that we need to know. Okay. The urinary system. So really kind of interesting system, underrated, something I didn't really appreciate until medical school with how important it is. But basically, the urinary system, as they say, right, controls the discharge of certain waste materials filtered by the blood from the kidneys. So a tremendous, I think it's like 35% of blood, so 35% of your blood goes to the kidneys for filtration. And so at the kidneys, it's sampling the blood and it's filtering products out, okay? So what happens is, water and salt and certain electrolytes will get filtered out of the blood, and waste products, urea, will get filtered out of the blood, and then it'll travel down through the kidneys, through the ureter, stored in the bladder, and it goes from the bladder to the urethra, out into the toilet, okay? So the other thing I want to talk about is like not just the waste, right? So it filters and eliminates waste. It controls the fluid balance in our body. So remember that whole aldosterone, renin, antidiuretic hormone stuff? That all plays a role in how much we're going to pee out, or how much water we're going to hold, and how tight the vessels squeeze down in the kidneys or don't squeeze down, right? And all these rules that we'll talk about some other time. So realize that the kidneys play a really big role in fluid control and fluid balance. And so this becomes important for blood pressure management. So the kidneys play a huge, huge, huge role in fluid management, which then consequently affects our blood pressure. Okay. And then pH. So what's pH? We've talked about this, right? This is the parts of hydrogen, right? So this controls the acidity and basicness of our blood. So, the kidneys produce this stuff called bicarbonate. We can also just urinate out hydrogen. so we can just pee out your acidic stuff sometimes if we need to. So the kidneys control the pH, they eliminate waste, they filter our blood, they also control our blood pressure and fluid management. So a very, very vital piece of our body. Very, very important for homeostasis. And something I want you to know as an EMT, this is an important foundational point. The kidneys are the kidneys are extremely perfusion dependent. What does that mean? They not just want, they demand that you give them blood. If you do not give them blood for whatever reason, they die really quickly, and so you end up with acute kidney injury. Okay, so the organs that we know of that require blood the most is the heart, the brain, and the kidneys. And so if we are bleeding out, or we have a heart attack or cardiogenic shock or some type of shock, right? Shock is simply defined as a lack of perfusion to cells. So if we have some type of shock, we end up with failure of the heart, the brain, and the kidneys. And the reason I keep hitting on this kidney thing, because as EMTs and paramedics, we really don't care about kidneys a lot because we don't see the effects of that. Because as an EMT, if I'm with a patient for an hour, I don't really know if the patient's kidneys just got wrecked out because I'm not going to look at their urine. Like I don't care as a paramedic or an EMT. So what I'm telling you is just take my word. The kidneys demand perfusion, and when they don't get it, they die really, really quickly. Just like the brain, just like the heart. This is what I showed you. The right kidney actually sits a little lower. And right here's the adrenal glands, remember? Okay, but this is the kidney. They, they filter blood, and then this is the ureter, and then they dump into the bladder, and from the bladder, it will go out through the urethra. Okay, so it goes kidney, ureter, bladder, urethra. Kidney, ureter, bladder, urethra. Got to know that pathway. Okay. And the reason this becomes important is because you've probably heard of someone having a kidney stone before, but that's when they get a big old chunk of stone right here, and it hurts. These are like stickers, like burrs, like rocks, and so it hurts really, really bad. So it causes extreme pain, and this causes the kidney to swell, and all this. You can get infection this way, so it's really painful. Get blood in your urine. It's really bad. So this is a pathology that we see. Okay. I'll have you know the kidney sit in the retroperitoneal space. What's that? Remember, the peritoneal is the front cavity of the abdomen. Retro means behind. So it sits in the behind peritoneal space, the retroperitoneal space. Why am I telling you that? If I hit you with a baseball bat with a kidney, you're going to bruise on your back in a specific pattern. Okay? So that's why it becomes kind of important. We just talked about this. I'm not going to tell you this again. We just talked about it in greater detail than this. So I do want to talk real quick about menstruation. Okay. So the ovaries, okay, these things, let me use my laser. They produce eggs. So these are eggs, right? And they produce follicles, right? So these are like matured eggs that are ready to be fertilized. Okay. So what happens is every 28 days, they will rupture and they will release an egg that normally it's 28 days. I want you to know humans aren't like time clocks. Sometimes it's not always 28 days. Ideally, it's 28 days. And so what happens is it'll release right here. Let me just zoom in. And then it kind of hangs out here. And what happens is if someone has sex and sperm is able to make its way up into the vagina and through the cervical opening, it will hope, if it works, it'll swim and meet up with this egg, right? And so when it meets up with this egg, it'll puncture this egg, and then fertilization occurs. Okay, so now we have a fertilized egg. Well, what should happen is it should keep making its way down here and fertilize over here into the uterus. And when it goes into the uterus, it'll attach on, and a lot of HCG and progesterone is produced, and this will produce this will progesterone means progestation, right? Like to promote gestation or pregnancy. It'll give the placenta, and it gives the body what it needs to make a baby, like to grow a baby, right, within the uterus. So that's what happens if we're going to get pregnant, right? But what happens more often than not, right, because we don't get pregnant every 28 days, is you don't get a fertilized egg. So what happens is you'll have an egg rupture, right? And so it hangs out here, and it's like, oh, I didn't get fertilized. Okay, that's fine. Most eggs don't. And then it's going to, I'm kind of jumping ahead. What happens is there's a surge in hormones. It's particularly estrogen, estrogen. And then what happens is during this time, the uterine wall starts building up. It starts getting really thick with like material. Okay, and so it's as it starts getting thick, it's trying progesterone is saying, "Oh, I want you to get pregnant." So if you do get a fertilized egg, I'm going to make this house really comfortable for this egg to attach to in the uterus. And so what happens is when that doesn't happen, the uterus will shed. So again, egg ruptures, it comes into the fallopian tubes. Okay, you don't get pregnant. Okay, so what happens is there's a sudden decrease in hormones, and then you will shed the uterine lining. Okay, because it's like, oh, we didn't get pregnant. So what happens is you shed the uterine wall, right? So all this buildup that just happened here no longer needed because you're not going to get pregnant. And so what happens is it sheds. So when it sheds, that's called menstruation. And when menstruation occurs, basically the shedding of the uterine wall will come out of the cervix and through the vagina, and this is known as a woman's period. It's pretty much mostly what you could see is blood, maybe a few small clumps of material, but it's blood. Okay, so this should happen every 28 days. Is it wildly crazy if it's 30 days for someone? No. If I mean, there's women that have their period every 2 months or whatever, and that's just their normal. Just know that ideally it's 28 days. And there's big hormonal changes that occur in this process. uh, it's kind of women can get cramps and abdominal pain and bloating and mood changes and cravings and all these sleep disturbances, all these things that happen because of these hormonal changes. But yeah, this will happen from the time of puberty onset to menopause, and that's how fertilization occurs. Okay, so this last thing, we've talked about this enough to where you can read these if you want, but these are pretty obvious things that we've covered. So with that, I know this was a long video. I appreciate y'all's time and paying attention. And yeah, have a good day.